This is the Consciousness Podcast, and I'm your host, Stuart Preston. Each episode, I have a conversation with an expert in human consciousness. In this episode, I welcome back previous guest, Riccardo Manzotti, along with his friend and co-author, Tim Parks. We discuss their new book, Dialogues on Consciousness, in which the two discuss the nature of consciousness. Tim Parks, novelist, essayist, and translator, is the author of 19 works of fiction, including Europa, shortlisted for the Booker Award. He is a regular contributor to both the New York Review of Books and the London Review of Books. He currently lives in Italy, where he teaches literature and translation studies at IULM in Milan. Riccardo Manzotti is a philosopher, psychologist, and robotics engineer who has written more than 50 scientific papers and several books. Among them, The Spread Mind, Why Consciousness and the World Are One. The former Fulbright visiting scholar at MIT is now visiting professor at UAEU University. We had a great conversation. Please enjoy this episode with Dr. Riccardo Manzotti and author Tim Parks. Starting here, Ricardo, you reached back out. I'm really excited to have you, back on the podcast. We had a great conversation. I think it was pretty recent, maybe 2 or 3, 4 months ago. We talked about Spread Mind. But now you guys have this new book coming out, the Dialogues. And so what I wanted to know is, how did this come about? How did you guys come up with this idea to put this in a book format? Tim, maybe you could start off and tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. I suppose I should say that as a novelist, I'm someone who's always been fascinated by, what's going on in the mind and so on. And one day about 7, 8 years ago, I happened on a conference where this young man is talking very excitedly about a completely different approach to consciousness, and we become friends and start talking about it. And we talked about it very hard for 3 or 4 years. It was a very fascinating period for me because Ricardo has a very special background and a very special preparation. And eventually, I simply said to him, look, Ricardo, these conversations are so fascinating. I think we could share them. So really, that's how it started. We just decided to give a lot of careful structure to the things that we were anyway talking about.
Yeah, if I may add one thing, in these dialogues between Tim and I, it is a thing that has always been fascinating for me was that Tim and I come from 2 completely different perspectives. He's a novelist. He lives in a world of words, basically, while I personally live in a world of much simpler experiences, phenomenal experiences. And so it was fascinating to see how our 2 very different perspectives somehow converge together in a very similar way. There are differences, but still they're surprisingly similar, given that we start from 2 completely different angles. Yeah,
I found it really interesting reading through the book. It almost felt like reading a transcript of a podcast. Tim asked really great questions and confronted you, Ricardo, on some of these things, would say, wait a minute, you're losing me, or wait a minute, I'm not sure that makes sense, or I'm not totally into that. So it was really, it's a lot of fun to read through, your conversation. So I'm really glad you guys did it. Now I am curious, obviously, Ricardo, I think, I don't know if you found me or I found you, but obviously consciousness is something that you're all about. So Tim, as a novelist and a writer, how did you come about becoming so curious about consciousness? What was the motivation behind that?
Well, I suppose the people who know my novels will know that a lot of the action is as it were in the head. They're about people facing crises which you would normally call mental crises, people on the edge of mental illness, you might say. So the whole question of consciousness has always been very interesting to me. The question of how the more conscious, rather than conscious, perhaps simply how the mind's working. But then, I translated a book about Eastern and particularly Vedic and pre-Vedic visions of how the mind works. So for me, when I came across Ricardo, or when we just happened to get together, it was an extraordinary moment to start looking more carefully at things, that I'd thought about in the past. I was particularly obsessed with the idea, how does the word adhere to the mind, because we get told that, that this or that part of our brain is a seat of linguistic performance, and if this or that neuron is stimulated, then this or that word will emerge, and so on. And yet you look in the brain and there are only neurons. So when I met Ricardo and heard his position, it was just an invitation to me to start putting some structure to things that had perplexed me for a long time.
And I might be jumping ahead on this question, but you piqued my curiosity. And before I ask the question, Ricardo, I should say I apologize. Now that I hear Tim pronouncing your name so properly, I can hear that I am massacring Ricardo. I just don't know if I have it in me to do it. So I apologize for that.
Anyways, fine.
Okay, thank you. But so Tim, I'm wondering, as you talk to Ricardo about spread mind and mind object, did it give you a new perspective on your words, your sentences, your phrases as objects that are bringing consciousness to your readers?
Yeah, absolutely. I got so interested in this conversation precisely because it did give me a whole new sense of what was going on at every moment of perception, and in the question of speaking and producing words. I began to be aware that what I had always thought of as mental was in fact just another form of physical activity, and that doing something like speaking or writing is not perhaps as different as deciding to walk somewhere or doing a dance. That is, you begin to stop thinking of things being stored in the brain and start thinking of having learned to do certain activities, which is rather different.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I hear your skepticism.
No, I'm not. I'm actually thinking, I don't know if I mentioned it to you, Ricardo, last time, but I do stand-up comedy as a hobby.
Nice.
And in a lot of things you do as a comedian is you craft your setups in such a way that it causes scripts to run in the minds of the audience members. And so that you can mess it all up and with a funny punchline, right? And so I can see how it's almost another tool in the craft of a writer as you're thinking about the objects that are in this mind and conjuring them up and what effect that has. It adds almost like a whole complete new layer to being an author, once you really start to understand, spread mind, which I can't say I totally do, but I can see it adding that whole new layer to your craft.
Well, yeah, I don't know how much I want to add to that. Certainly, almost any form of language takes you in a particular direction. A sentence requires a particular structure. There are a whole load of sort of gambits in conversation, and we know where they're going. So as a stand-up comedian, you simply decide to slip in something completely different at a certain point and sort of shock people, wake them up. Certainly writers are thinking about that a lot. I don't know how much it would change my writing, but it certainly made me more exciting about thinking about what's going on.
Yeah, interesting. So Ricardo, with you, as you guys had these conversations, as I read through it, it was pretty familiar, in terms of our last conversation, but, through the very direct questions that Tim was asking in your conversations, did any new revelations on spread mind or any new insights, any changes to your theories and your beliefs?
Yes, of course. I mean, working with Tim, speaking with Tim has been incredibly useful for me because Tim is a writer, a novelist, so he's able to see through words. So he was always able to see whether I was just building up a house of cards or whether I was up to something that was down to earth. And he was also able to has a kind of detector for any sentence that is not clear. You know, I come from culture in the language where it is very easy to build a house of cards, while English is a lot more down to earth, as I said. And so, I mean, working with him has been super useful for me because it helped me to be as close as possible to a core set of fundamental notions. And so I've been able in the end to reduce all of the original idea to a very small set of basic ideas. And like, for example, the notion of the relative object and the notion, which is basically the one of the two fundamental ideas behind the spread mind, or the notion of the identity between our experience and the world. So he obliged me to be extremely clear, and that is something for which I'm very thankful to Tim. And another thing that I must say that I owe to Tim is the very name of the spread mind. I mean, he suggested the expression spread mind in one of these conversations, so I owe it to him.
Oh, wonderful. That's awesome. That's a good collaboration there.
Well, I hope I'll be invited when he wins the Nobel, Stuart.
Yeah, I do too. That would be a great moment. or maybe you in literature, and then you can invite him. So we'll see.
Doubt that,
yeah. Okay, so let's dive into the meat of it then. So maybe kind of start off the same way you guys started the book, in defining or describing, you know, what is consciousness. I don't know which one of you wants to dive into that one. So what do you guys think? Do you guys share opinions or ideas, or do you disagree on a lot of this stuff?
I think this whole conversation started with me as it were, skeptical disciple or possible disciple, and Ricardo spending many hours and sending me back to read things and so on. So gradually, I very much come around to his position, but I disagree with him on some of the emphasis. For example, the whole question of the role of the body and the body as a part of our experience, I somewhat disagree with, but or at least I feel he has the emphasis wrong. But these are not things probably that our listeners are gonna get a grip on until we tackle the main issue. So let me just say right away, the idea is essentially this: that we stop thinking of consciousness as an inner representation of an outer world. That is, we stop thinking of the idea of the world as somehow doubled up in our mind, somehow repeated. And we reach the conclusion that because in our head there are only, although very interestingly, 85 billion neurons, there are not colors, there are not objects, there are not words, there are not tunes in our heads. Since that is the case, the experience that what we call experience is the world as it meets our bodies. It is our bodies come to the world and bring their equipment to the world and give the world an opportunity to be what it is, which is our experience. So that is the core idea, the elimination of the idea of representation in the head.
Yeah, if I may.
So is that where you? Sorry, go ahead, Ricardo. Yeah,
I mean,
please.
We are trying to debunk a myth, a modern myth. The modern myth is that we have a mental world inside our head. This is something that science is often suggesting, but it has completely no evidence about that. Nobody has ever found anything like our experience inside the head. And science, neuroscience in particular, keeps asking us to believe into the existence of something that is completely invisible to scientific instrumentation that cannot be measured, namely our conscious experience. And in order to justify that we cannot measure or see through traditional means our inner world, our mental inner world, neuroscientists keep telling us that consciousness is invisible, that consciousness is phenomenal, where phenomenal simply means something that cannot be seen through scientific or other means. And this is really unbelievable to me. So we are debunking this myth that there's an inner mental world. There isn't anything like that. And then we are suggesting where to look in order to find the very familiar world we experience every day, but not inside the head, but in the world itself, which seems so obvious when you start thinking about it that you may be surprised that so many people are still looking inside a invisible container that nobody has ever seen, called the mind.
Obvious, but not intuitive, which probably leads so many of us to have that myth. It's like you said, that phenomenal feeling. It just feels like it's coming from inside one's head, or some might even say from inside one's heart. You have these phenomenal feelings. Yeah, please, Tim.
Can I say something about that? You say it's not intuitive, but if you were, for example, simply walking in the countryside and enjoying one of those periods where you are not talking to yourself, as it were, you are simply maybe just whistling, walking along. What do you have? You have a world outside, and you have your whistling, which is a performance like you're walking. Okay, there is no need to think of the whistling as it were in your head. When you say that intuitively we think of it in our head, we're basically thinking that our talking to ourselves without talking aloud is in our head. And I think that's the thing that one grapples with and that presents a problem. And that when we start thinking of that as an action, as a physical action, we know that our vocal cords all move when we talk to ourselves inside our head, that we've simply learned to talk silently. Then it does get a little bit less difficult, I think, to start realizing that we're actually performing all the time in our thoughts rather than having a special mental world.
What do you mean by we're performing our thoughts?
Well, we're talking now, and each of us are performing in the sense of each of us are doing something. Let's just say there are physical actions, which speaking, walking, peeling potatoes, thinking, and they are not actually so different from each other.
When you get to the thinking part, though, it feels different. I think that's the part that maybe I was thinking that feels intuitive, is the thoughts feel like they're emanating from inside my head. And when I see a mountain here in Arizona, I have a feeling of that mountain that feels like it's inside my head.
Yeah, well, I often ask this question to my students during my classes. I ask them, talk to me about your thoughts, about your inner thoughts. And they start to say, well, they reply something like, well, I'm thinking about my house, I'm thinking about where I live, about my car. And then I said to them, no, I didn't want you to speak about your car, your building, or whatever. I want you to speak only about your thoughts. And then they say, well, I am thinking of my mom, and thinking of my siblings, and thinking of my video games. And then I keep asking them, no, I don't want you to talk with me about video games, moms, and whatever, but just about your thoughts. And then they say to me, it's impossible, because there isn't anything like a thought without what the thought is about. So I'm asking them, then why don't you simply tell me that you're not that you're thinking about those things, but that those things are actually acting through you, through your body, and are producing an action of some kind through your body. So my point is that we have introduced historically we have introduced the notion of thought as something invisible that should be between previous events and our words. But do we really need them, or are they just some kind of narrative about the narrative? So something that we introduce as an invisible character that nobody can ever see.
And is that related to, and I don't want to give your whole book away, but is that related to the pizza experiment, where Tim was saying, I'm thinking about a pizza, and you were saying, well, not just the object of the pizza, but what are some of the other thoughts surrounding that the pizza is basically providing to you?
Yeah, let me just say that this is a classic of what it's like talking to Ricardo, because we're immediately very seriously challenged. And a lot of the problem is a linguistic problem. We say, for example, I'm thinking about a pizza. Okay, what does this actually mean? Am I verbally thinking about a pizza, saying, I'd like to go for a pizza? Am I seeing a pizza? Certainly not in the way I would see a pizza once I just ordered it and it's sitting steaming there on the plate. Okay, so there is something that's happened that pizza has suddenly become present to me. Do we really need the word thinking? Or Ricardo might say to us, well, you've eaten a lot of pizzas in your life. You've got a lot of neurons in your head, a lot of experiences has happened, and these pizzas are still active upon you. Okay, and there you are. You can use the word thinking as a nice shorthand, as a nice quick way of saying, pizza, maybe we could go out this evening, but you don't really need to start thinking that there is a special kind of mental activity which is not physical, and which is then mysterious, and then which gives human beings a special feeling of pride because they live in a slightly different world. You don't need all of that. I think that's the position Ricardo's putting forward.
Okay. That makes sense. Since we're talking about these representations in our mind, I don't know if you'd be willing to talk about the red square and the white square experiment. As I read through that, and I even did it myself, and I was amazed that I was seeing the color that I was seeing. It's if you'd asked me that, I never would have predicted that. Along with the swirl that you're looking at, they're the same colors, but I'm curious about the red square and the white square. When you concentrate on the red square and then you shift your focus to the white square, you see a color. And how does that relate to the object working within my mind? Is that an easy enough explanation?
Yes, no, that's a great point. That's a case of after images that has been systematically described in the wrong way or at least in most of the literature, both in neuroscience and in philosophy. And it has been described in the wrong way with a couple of colors, red and green, rather than actual couple of colors, which is red and cyan, which is a kind of blue-green, quite different, because traditional neuroscientists and philosophers accepted the idea that colors are kind of mental entity. So once you accept that idea, basically any color may produce any other color. And if you have a color space in which green is the opponent of red, it makes sense that after watching a red square, you're going to see green squares everywhere, particularly against a gray square. However, this is not the case. As you tried, and as people can try on our website, after staring a red square, you're going to see a cyan square, cyan color. Now, the question is, why is that so important? Because the cyan can be explained differently from green, can be explained by suggesting that because your retina has changed during the time you spend staring at the red square, your retina is now red blind. because your retina is red blind, when you watch the gray square, which contains in equal measure both green, red, and blue, because you're red blind, you're going to see the leftover, the chromatic leftover, which is a combination both of green and blue, which is cyan. So this is a crucial experiment because it shows that by changing our body, the world around us is different because the world exists relative to our body. And so how can we see something different? By changing our body. But is what we see something that is not real? No, it is just as real as everything else. It is just relative to our body that has changed.
Yeah, can I offer, because I'm aware that this is quite difficult. Can I try and offer a succinct, quick version of this? We all know that if you stare at, say, a red square, okay, and then move your eyes after you've looked at it for a certain amount of time, so that your eyes are sort of soaked up in the red, you move your eyes to a neutral white or gray square, and for a few short moments, you see another color. Okay, now this has always been taken as proof by people who think that everything's in your head, that since that we know that that square is white or gray, and instead we're seeing green, this means that colors, well, we're not seeing green actually, we're seeing blue-green, that this means that colors are generated in the head. And what Ricardo has been able to demonstrate is that for every color that you look at and saturate your eyes with, and then move your eyes to the white, you can predict what different color you will see by simply removing the original color from the white, and you will see the leftover. So what he's suggested is that it's not inside the head, but that we are actually seeing for a moment the color that's in there without the red. So the body has changed because for a moment it's been saturated with red, and so we're a little blind to red for a moment, like when we look at the sun, and the world's changed for a moment when we look elsewhere. So we bring a slightly different body to the white paper. We don't see the red in it, and we only see the blue-green in it. That is the idea, basically.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's also, as you say, in the book, about perspective, that we all have our own unique experience based on objects interacting with us and within time. And so with this experiment, I'm looking from the red to the white square. Somebody else may have been staring at a blue square, thus removing the blue. And when we both turn our eyes at the same time to that same square, we're getting two different colors.
For sure. Correct. For a moment.
Yeah. Interesting. And so now I'd like to jump into another subject from the book, if you don't mind, something that's, it was kind of shocking to me, and it shook some foundations of my own personal philosophies, is when you talk about, quote, the now, right, the present moment. And I kind of liked the back and forth that you guys had, because I feel like, Tim, you're like, well, this isn't making sense to me. Explain this, and, some good examples from constellations and different things. And so, when you're talking about dreams, maybe hallucinations, thoughts in one's mind that are made up basically of experiences that one has already had with an object. But you're saying that when you feel that experience, it's not happening in time, that there is no now. And so maybe we could talk a little bit about if there's no now, is there no time? Is time something that was just constructed from another object? So I don't know if you want to jump in and kind of talk about what does now mean or not mean.
Yeah. Well, let me try to say something about that. Then maybe Tim will correct me. Not clear enough. No, I mean, we always assume that there is a now, which is the traditional Newtonian idea that there is a point like moment, which is with almost no dimension, with almost no extension, and that everything takes place in that moment. But if we consider what's going on from a physical perspective, based on what Einstein discovered, there isn't anything like that, for the simple reason that everything takes time. So when I watch at the other side of the street, what's going on at the other side of the street is taking place sometime before the activity in my brain. And when I watch at the TV screen, what's going on the TV screen is also taking place sometime before what's going on inside my brain. And that's because everything, as I said before, takes time. So there isn't such a thing as a point in time where everything takes place. There are many points, and each of these points is separate, not only by space, but also by time. And that it is quite straightforward in the case of the moon or the sun or the stars. In that case, the time is pretty large. It can be really, it can be 8 minutes for the sun. It can be even longer for stars. Does that mean that the sun is not in our now? Does that mean that the stars we see during a starry night are not in our night, in our now? Of course not. The idea is to spread also the notion of the now in order to over-encompass events that are producing an effect in our body, and that therefore events that are relative to our body, but events that are also based on the Newtonian and old-fashioned notion of the now in the past. So the idea is that we have to spread the notion of the present. And once we do that, we include in that notion not only perception, but also other kinds of experience, such as memory, imagination, hallucination, and the like.
Yeah. I think it is worth actually repeating these things because I think they are difficult. So what Ricardo's telling us then is that in any experience there is a time distance, or there is simply movement between us and any object, and that is different depending on the distance of the object from us. So if we look at the mountains, it will be a certain number of milliseconds, and if we look at the teacup in front of us, it will be less. And we must always also remember that when the photons contact the eye, there is still milliseconds of neural activity before the experience takes place. So once you have established that any experience is spread across time, as if you like, is the body here, the world there. Once you've done that, is there any major obstacle to saying, but if it can be spread for a millisecond here and 10 milliseconds there and 10 seconds there and 8 minutes to the sun and 100 years to this star, is there any reason why experience cannot be spread out in the way that when I dream something, my contact with the object is no different from the contact than when I was present physically with it?
Yeah, so if I can add just a follow-up. Think about these two completely different models. On the one side, we have the traditional model of dreams, according to which when we sleep, for some completely unknown reasons, our brains start to project a world made of images, of sounds, and an inner world that apparently has no clear goal in itself. But the brain does all that activity for some unknown reasons, in a completely mysterious ways. And now let's consider a completely different model, the model that is suggested by the spread mind. According to this model, our brain is an object in a flow of space-time events. These events are spread across all our life. So some of them are very close to the brain, both in space and in time, and some of them are farther away. But they're all taking place relative to the brain. Some of those events took place many years ago, a few months ago, a few hours ago. But it is a huge flow of events. And we call just the last part of this flow the present in our everyday language, and only the events inside that final section perception. And we call all the rest of this huge flow, huge river of events, we call it either memory or dreams or hallucination. And when we don't focus our experience on the last part of the flow, as it happens in everyday life, we can still perceive the whole flow of events. And that happens, for example, when our body is having a rest and we are not pressed by what's going on in the proximal surrounding of our body, and all our life, in a way, is still impinging on our brain. And that kind of delayed perception is what we usually call dreams. What's easier? What's more economical?
It took me months to get my mind around this, Stuart.
Yeah, and I think it will me too. You know, I think of like a real life example of standing next to a train going by, and I can hear the noise, the siren of the train. I can hear the wheels screeching against the tracks. I can feel the sunlight hitting my face. I can smell the diesel. I can feel the ground shake. And those are all objects creating a conscious image or experience that are all spread over time and distance. But somehow my brain seems to package them all together into one experience that feels like it's happening right now.
Well, they're all in slightly different time positions, obviously, because we know that sound travels at a different time from the visual. But they're not creating an image for you. Your body's just allowing them to happen, and their happening is your experience. Let me go back for 1 second on the dream business. Mm-hmm. We have 85 billion neurons with trillions upon trillions of connections. Let's imagine that for proximate experience, where we need to be in contact with the world and able to react to opportunities and dangers. Let's imagine that we have a very direct passage, a very direct exchange between our sense perceptions, our brain, and the world. But let's imagine that there are infinite eddies, backwaters, places where the same neuronal activity can, as it were, go around forever, if you like, ticking over. And then, as Ricardo says, when we go to bed to sleep and we no longer need to be in contact with that proximate world, there are a lot of things that can come out and start playing again, you know? And I think that kind of does make it possible to start thinking about dreams in this way. Not things that are stored, but experience still going on.
And what do you mean by experience still going on? So once an object...
Experience still going on would be a dream. All kinds of old experiences may be mingling together, no? Dreams are very rarely a straight reenactment of the world, but they're never anything totally new. You may have a bit of one person attached to another person, or you may have an angel's wings on a donkey, but you're never going to have anything that nobody's ever seen or heard of before. This is something that Descartes had observed, that in dreams, but also in the imagination, whenever we try, for example, in the imagination to imagine a monster, we're basically putting together bits of other animals, and that's, dreams are an amalgam of old experience. They're not a new color, a new sound, a new perception.
And the same thing goes with creativity and inspiration. So when you write a new story, or a new part of a story, or a character, or a setting in a novel, that creative inspiration may feel brand new to you, but when you really start looking at it, it is just combinations of objects that are already there.
Let's not say just combinations.
Let's not say that. I actually don't like that word. Let's not say that.
Yeah, the imagination is precisely form. Everybody knows that art is form, and form is rearrangement, and that's imagination. But the material is always the same, as we know.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Ricardo, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, just about combination. Think about natural evolution and DNA. I mean, all animals, all living organisms have been created just through combination. So combination is a big power. I mean, it's not a little thing.
Right. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to minimize that with the word just. I will throw that out. Yeah, it bothers me when I go to a restaurant with my wife and they say just two. I said, what do you mean just two? We're the best two.
Exactly. Good example.
Yes.
Still, can I say how interesting it is that it was quite natural for you to use the word just, and you naturally use the word just because we like to imagine that we create things ex novo. That is in all our standard positions about consciousness and about the imagination and so on. There's an awful lot of wishful thinking about the special status of the human race. That makes us feel better about the sometimes miserable business of existence.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it is easy, and it did roll right off my tongue. I want to ask one more, and this is going to be kind of one of those far out questions I alluded to, but before I get to the wrap up questions, I wanted to ask this, because if you guys may or may not know, I talk to different people in different points of view when it comes to consciousness. I mean, everything from philosophy to neuroscience, and even some religion with Buddhism, near-death experiences. And one thing that I hear people talk about is the brain is like a radio receiver, and that there is a universal consciousness out there that is essentially the transmitter, and it transmits, and your brain tunes into that greater consciousness. And I was reminded of this concept because I think, Tim, I was watching a video interview that you were having, and somebody, I think they asked you something like, does consciousness from objects just kind of float through the air to the brain? And when they asked that question, I thought, well, that's too simple, and it implies physics. It implies something that we can look at. But then I thought about these other philosophers and people who had brought up this notion that there is a universal consciousness out there that your brain tunes into. And some of them will talk about altered states of consciousness that maybe open your mind to more of that consciousness. Have the two of you ever, after a couple glasses of wine or something, kind of gone far out there and said, the consciousness that comes from these objects, instead of pointing like a vector straight into my brain, is it actually going through a medium that might be considered something like a cosmic or a universal consciousness? Have you guys explored that notion at all, or is that too far out there?
Well, no, absolutely not. I mean, I would totally disagree with the notion of universal consciousness. At least this is not I've ever experienced. My personal experience of the world has always been limited to my surroundings and not much else. And I would also disagree with the notion that consciousness goes from the object to the brain, or that the brain is the receiver of consciousness, because that would suggest, once again, the notion that consciousness is something over and above and different from the physical world, while my goal is that of suggesting an explanation of consciousness that does not need to add anything special ingredient to the natural world. So we would not say in the spread mind that consciousness goes from objects to the brain. We would just say that consciousness is identical with the objects, and that the brain is one of the physical conditions that allow the existence of such objects.
Yeah.
And it's the whole body. It's the whole body that facilitates this consciousness. Is that?
Yeah. Can I just say that we need to put a little bit of pressure on this word consciousness and decide what we want to do with it, because I think the way it's often used, there's a suggestion that it's some kind of ethereal, mystical, mental substance. Okay. Now, and then you get a philosopher like Daniel Dennett coming along and trying to describe the world really without needing to use the word consciousness. And then everybody says, well, he's a consciousness denier. We all know that we have this mental world. I think what Ricardo's trying to do here is not to deny consciousness, but to say what we have come to call consciousness, and we've needed to invent that word because we think it's in our head, whereas the world we're perceiving is clearly out there. Why don't we make this word consciousness simply identical with that outer world which our body meets and which we allow to happen? We've just said we could create a situation where two people are looking at a white piece of paper, and because they've previously looked at different colors, when they come to that white piece of paper, I see blue-green and you see red, okay, for example. Okay, so that white piece of paper, which is white for normal circumstances of our body, is different. It hasn't for different circumstances of our body. It has no absolute existence. And our consciousness is the body as it is now, meeting that world. I don't know if I've made that clearer or just made it harder work. And
no, you did. No, that actually was helpful. And as you were saying it, I thought, okay, this is starting to come together for me. So after 2 hours of talking to Ricardo, I'm just now starting to possibly understand this. There is a bit of it that as it starts to be clear that it feels very.
Ricardo and I often say that if Ricardo could spend about 200 hours with each major influential person on the planet, after about 10 years, everybody would start to begin to understand what he's talking about.
Yeah, it's I don't know. It feels so simple and so difficult to understand, or to take in and to fully integrate.
Let me give you another example, which is again an example that Ricardo suggested, but I think that helps a lot, because what we're trying to have people imagine is that the world they experience is not an absolute world, but a different world, whatever different body, whether it be you or a dog or a bat or your friend, comes to it. But you can experience this with your own body. If you put a hand in your pocket and there's a coin and you feel it, there's a whole range of physical experience which comes into existence with touch. If you take the coin out of the pocket and look at it, there's a physical experience that wasn't available when it was in the pocket, and now is different and completely different from touch. So every way we come to the world, it comes into existence differently, and that's what we call consciousness.
I like it. Yeah, that's great. Awesome. So as a kind of a wrap up, here, are you still having these conversations? Are you going to publish more of these, or what other topics do you guys explore that we might hear about?
I mean, of course, we keep having this conversation, and the previous conversation required many years to be carried along, and only now we got the book. So I think we will need some more years in order to have another
Right.
output like that.
I'm rather terrified by the idea of covering covering a lot more territory, because we did cover an awful amount of territory in this book. Ricardo has been doing a lot of work now on the whole concept of information, and has been throwing some totally fascinating ideas at me, which again I've been struggling to get my mind around. So maybe one day we'll talk a bit more. We do talk a little bit about information in the book, but that's something we're talking about with excitement now.
Yeah, I could see that information and memories. There were a few things you guys dove into that I would love to hear you guys talk more about. Looking to the future of our understanding of consciousness, and not just your explorations, but other things you see out there in the world. Is there anything out there that you see that you're excited about? Any breakthroughs or discoveries or advancements in our understanding of consciousness? Anything you guys have seen out there in the world?
Well, yes, there is one thing that I think it would be very important in the future, namely the fact that in the last 300-400 years, we have been asked to believe in the objective world as dictated by science. And basically what science did was to suggest that there was an objective world, and everything else was cast into the dustbin of the mind, into the dustbin of subjective experience. So we had this picture of the world in which there is just one truth, and that truth is the only possible truth, and that is revealed by science, and all our personal experiences, individual worlds, were just downgraded to subjective inner worlds. I think that one of the goals of the spread mind is to suggest a different worldview, in which everyone is living in a world which is not just a mental world, is a real world, is a relative world. And it is not any worse than the world that is discovered by science. It is maybe smaller, it is maybe limited to a smaller set of events, but it is just as real. So one of the points of the spread mind that I would like to exploit in the future and to explore is to see how our life changes when we stop thinking that our world is a subjective inner domain, and rather to consider a completely different option, namely that we are all kind of world creators, but worlds that are real, worlds that are made of real stuff.
Right.
Yeah,
and as I listen to that, I start to get excited and nervous. So I think there's definitely some power in knowing that there's something outside of this one hard, objective perspective that we've been handed over the last 300 or 400 years.
I think one of the things that got me most excited about Ricardo's ideas is that they are profoundly anti-authoritarian, and they well describe many experiences that you can move over into the world of books and literature as well. For example, very simply, everybody comes to a book and has a different experience, partly because when they read it, they may be paying more attention at different moments, partly because this word or that word may mean something slightly different to them, partly because they bring different experience to it. And we normally talk about that as subjective, as if it was somehow whimsical or a caprice. I decided to like this, or I decided not to like this. But that's not actually our experience of books. When we go to a book and dislike it, we can't kind of decide to like it or not to like it. We bring our world to it, and the book happens as is possible for our world. If somebody changes our world, or over the years our world changes, we come back to the book and maybe it's different. But in any event, as far as new things is concerned, I'm a very lucky guy in that Ricardo, who is keeping eagle's eye on developments in neuroscience and philosophy, is constantly emailing me interesting articles about this or that development. So I'm I just have almost too much to read about all kinds of intriguing experiments going on.
Wonderful. Well, great. Is there, before we wrap up, is there anything else you guys wanted to make sure and get out there?
I'm fine.
I think we've covered a lot of stuff. So if you get anything, I'm happy with that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, wonderful. Well, Ricardo, so nice to talk to you and learn from you again. And Tim, it was great to have you on and get to know you. And I really appreciate both you and your time and your contributions to all of this.
Thank you.
Thanks,
It's
Stuart.
been great. I love it.
That concludes another edition of the Consciousness Podcast. Thanks again for listening. Please find us at Facebook at facebook.com/The Consciousness Podcast, at our Twitter handle at Conchcast, and don't forget to subscribe to our feed at theconsciousnesspodcast.com. Thank you for listening.